There's something profoundly destabilizing that happens when a man builds his identity around the woman he desires. He doesn't notice it at first. It starts with the excitement of connection, the pull of attraction, and the genuine desire to be close to her. But slowly, without realizing it, he starts handing over pieces of his center. He starts seeking approval, trying to please, adjusting his words to be more palatable, reshaping his opinions to match hers. And before long, he's no longer grounded in himself, he's orbiting around her. That orbit might feel like love, but it's actually disconnection from self. She can sense it, even if she doesn't consciously know what's changed. She feels the shift. That calm masculine presence she was drawn to in the beginning, the man who had his own thoughts, his own rhythm, his own direction, starts fading. He's no longer leading his life. He's reacting to hers. And as soon as that shift happens, the respect begins to erode because she no longer feels the polarity that makes her feel safe. That deep-rooted masculine energy that stands still in the storm, not because it's indifferent, but because it's anchored, starts to feel unstable. He becomes emotionally volatile, not always outwardly, but in subtle ways. Overthinking, doubting, looking for reassurance in places he should have drawn strength from within. When you lose your center, you begin to lean. And leaning, emotionally, is pressure. It's the weight of insecurity that starts to pull the connection into imbalance. She begins to feel responsible for your emotional stability. And that responsibility creates tension, not trust. She no longer sees you as the man who leads himself, but as someone who needs her to feel okay. And that need, no matter how gently it shows up, starts to feel heavy. Masculine presence isn't about being emotionally cold, it's about being emotionally sovereign. A man who can feel deeply without being owned by those feelings, who can love without losing his sense of self, who doesn't collapse under the weight of desire, that kind of man is rare, and he commands respect, not because he demands it, but because his stability speaks louder than anything he could say. But when you make her your emotional anchor, you create a bond rooted in imbalance. And bonds like that don't create safety, they create confusion. Because she doesn't want to lead you emotionally, she wants to feel led by your groundedness, to feel free to open, knowing that you're not going to get lost inside her. So if you ever feel like you're being disrespected, ignored, or taken for granted, ask yourself, have you abandoned your center? Because a man who detaches from himself to hold on to her will lose both. There's a quiet strength in detachment that most people don't understand. It's not coldness, it's not indifference, it's not apathy. It's the ability to remain present and grounded without allowing someone else's validation to define your sense of worth. And that kind of presence, when it's authentic, carries a rare kind of weight. A man who can walk away, not out of bitterness, not out of pride, but from a place of inner certainty, becomes someone who is impossible to forget. Because that man communicates something far deeper than charm or effort ever could. He communicates value, not through words, but through absence. Scarcity isn't about manipulation. It's about understanding that your time, your energy, your emotional availability, those things have worth. And when you detach, when you no longer try to persuade someone to see you, to choose you, to appreciate you, you're declaring without drama that your presence is earned, not begged for. That quiet, resolute detachment sends a message that echoes louder than any emotional display. I am not available for inconsistency. Women recognize that. Not always immediately, sometimes not until weeks or months later, but the impact lands eventually. Because we live in a world saturated with neediness, with over-explaining, with people clinging to what isn't choosing them back. So when a man calmly detaches, when he exits without noise, without explanation, without trying to be understood, he leaves behind a contrast, a void. And in that void, she starts to feel something she didn't expect to feel, respect. There's a shift that occurs when a man no longer seeks external permission to be whole, when he no longer offers himself to someone who's unsure, when he finally says, not with words, but with behavior, if you cannot meet me with presence, I will meet myself in peace. That shift reclaims his energy. It brings him back to his center, and In doing so, it creates a gravitational pull. Because women don't respect men who argue for their worth. They respect men who embody it. The man who can detach fully, who doesn't need closure, who doesn't need validation, who doesn't spiral in absence, that man becomes scarce by nature. And scarcity creates value. Not because he's trying to be desired, but because he's refusing to be discounted. And that refusal, held with calm, not ego, creates emotional polarity. It creates curiosity. It makes her wonder what she failed to see when he was still around. She may not feel it immediately. She may even think she's unbothered. But the mind always revisits what was stable and rare, especially when chaos and noise follow afterward. And when she finally understands that he didn't detach to hurt her, but to honor himself, that's when the respect begins to grow in silence. You don't become valuable by chasing love. You become valuable by being the man who can walk away from where it isn't clearly returned. When you chase someone, emotionally, mentally, or even physically, you disrupt something very important, their space to feel. You override their emotional process by filling it with your own. What you might see as effort or passion, they often experience as pressure. And the more you press, the less they reflect, because they're not being given the space to wonder what your presence meant. You've already filled that space with need, with explanation, with reminders, with energy they didn't ask for. And when you fill someone's space with your own anxiety, you rob them of the ability to actually feel their own. Curiosity dies the moment control enters the room. And chasing, at its core, is a subtle form of control. It's an attempt to steer someone's perception of you, to influence their decision, to ensure they see you, value you, miss you. But the irony is, the more you try to influence that process, the more they emotionally shut down. Not necessarily because they don't care, but because they feel overwhelmed. The energy becomes too much. There's no room left for natural emotion. It becomes about escaping your intensity, not reflecting on what they might lose. But when you detach, you do the opposite. You remove the pressure. You create emotional contrast. Your silence allows their own thoughts to rise. They begin to hear the echoes of your absence. And instead of being pushed toward a conclusion, they begin to arrive at one on their own. That's the moment when they feel the weight of what you brought, the stability, the energy, the consistency. And without you forcing it, they begin to compare, not because you told them to, but because space gave them the chance to. Everyone has their own emotional process. Some people only understand the value of someone once that presence is no longer there to lean on. But if you don't give them that moment, if you're constantly inserting yourself into their space, you rob them of that realization. You prevent them from ever truly seeing you clearly, because all they feel is pressure. And pressure doesn't awaken love, it numbs it. And that's why detachment is powerful, not just as a boundary, but as a gift. It's the gift of space. It says, I've shown up fully, you've seen what I offer, now I'll let you decide if it mattered. That kind of confidence is unforgettable, because it doesn't try to convince, it simply exists, quietly, calmly. And in that quiet, people begin to feel what noise never allowed them to. Let her come to her own understanding, because that's the only understanding that lasts. Respect doesn't come from words. It doesn't come from gifts, grand gestures, or endless sacrifices. It comes from boundaries. Quiet, unshakable boundaries that say, this is what I allow, and this is what I don't. And those boundaries are only respected when you're willing to enforce them without explanation, without pleading, and without emotional collapse. A man who holds his line, not with aggression, but with calm conviction, earns more respect in silence than most earn through years of overextension. When a woman sees that you're emotionally unmoved by tests, by withdrawal, by inconsistent behavior, she begins to feel something rare, structure, not dominance, not control, but a kind of quiet strength that gives her something to push against without breaking you. She doesn't want you to chase when she pulls back. She doesn't want you to fall apart when she's distant. She wants to know that you can hold the space, that you can remain still without needing her to complete you. And that kind of stillness, that kind of emotional boundary is magnetic, not because it begs for respect, but because it commands it. And you don't have to raise your voice, you don't have to explain why you're pulling back when your effort goes unmatched. You just stop offering energy to what doesn't reciprocate. You show her through your restraint that you value yourself too much to stay in a place where your presence is met with indifference. That message speaks volumes. It says, I won't fight for love, I'll honor it when it's mutual, but I will never chase it when it's unclear. The men who gain the deepest respect from women are not the loudest. They're not the most emotional. They're the ones who never compromise their dignity to be seen. The ones who can feel deeply, yes, but never so deeply that they abandon their self-worth in the name of connection. And that's the kind of man who stays in her mind long after he's walked away. Not because he created drama, but because he never tolerated disrespect in the first place. People learn how to treat you by what you allow. And every time you overstay in confusion, every time you explain yourself to someone who isn't listening, every time you make excuses for someone who's emotionally absent, you quietly lower your own value. Not in her eyes first, but in your own. And when your self-respect diminishes, so does the energy that made you attractive in the first place. Real boundaries don't require threats. They require consistency. They're not about making her feel small. They're about keeping yourself whole. Because if you have to abandon yourself to keep someone close, you were never really respected to begin with. People don't respect what's always available, not because they're cruel, but because human nature responds to contrast. When something is constantly there, always accessible, always responding, it starts to blend into the background. And when that happens, the mind forgets to value it. That's the paradox. You think being there all the time proves your loyalty, your commitment, your sincerity. But to someone who hasn't yet earned it, it comes across as emotional excess. It overwhelms, it dulls curiosity, and worse, it removes the opportunity for her to feel the loss. Loss is a powerful teacher. It creates silence, and in silence, reflection grows. When you're constantly present, she never has to sit with the emptiness of your absence. She never has to think about what your consistency meant. She never wonders how her life feels without your emotional support, your attention, your grounding presence. Because she's never had to go without it. And when someone never feels the absence of something, they don't question their attachment to it. They simply assume it will always be there. That's where comfort turns into entitlement. But the moment you detach, genuinely, completely, not out of spite, but from self-respect, the dynamic shifts. Your silence begins to echo in the space she once took for granted. She starts to notice the subtle ways your presence influenced her stability. She notices the way she felt seen, the way she felt calm, the way you didn't demand but gave. And now that you're not there to absorb her confusion or hold the emotional tension, she's left to process it herself. That processing is what often ignites a deeper kind of respect. Because it isn't forced. It's not a reaction to your effort. It's a recognition of your value, discovered only in your absence. Now, you don't need to make speeches, write long messages, or try to explain why you're backing away. You just do it with clarity, with calm, with conviction. No anger, no resentment, just detachment. And that detachment tells her something no words ever could. You are willing to give, but only where it's returned. You're not punishing her. You're just stepping out of a space where your presence was treated casually. When she finally feels that shift, when she realizes you're no longer emotionally available for a one-sided connection, something important happens. She starts to ask herself questions. Why did he leave? Why did he stop reaching out? What did I overlook? And those questions, unlike anything you could have said, begin to build awareness. And that awareness, if she's capable of it, becomes respect. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is leave the space wide open and let your absence do the explaining. There's a rare kind of strength in the man who can walk away in silence, not because he's cold, not because he stopped caring, but because he refuses to beg for respect. That kind of man carries something different. He doesn't explode, he doesn't argue, he doesn't chase, he just disappears with calm. That calmness isn't emptiness, it's the presence of self-worth. It's a declaration that says, I know what I bring, and if it's not valued here, I won't force it. And that quiet detachment isn't easily forgotten. It lingers because it reflects something she's not used to seeing, emotional sovereignty. And when a man knows who he is, when he doesn't derive his worth from whether or not someone chooses him, he radiates a sense of completeness. He's not emotionally reactive because he doesn't need to be. He's not trying to win her attention because he knows his presence was already the prize. And when that kind of man walks away, not as a strategy, but as a natural consequence of being unappreciated, it creates a deeper impact than any words ever could. She might not recognize it at first. Maybe she even tells herself she doesn't care. But slowly in the quiet moments, in the absence of that calm strength, she starts to feel it. She remembers the way he didn't flinch, the way he didn't collapse when she pushed him away, the way he didn't react with desperation or resentment. That stillness begins to replay in her mind, not as an act of indifference, but as the presence of something solid, something secure, something she may not have been ready for but now can't forget. You see, the man who walks away emotionally clean leaves no mess behind, no chaos, no guilt trips. And that's what sets him apart. He doesn't try to manipulate the situation or force closure. He simply exits quietly because he knows that dignity doesn't scream, it doesn't plead, it just leaves. And the absence of that calm masculine energy often speaks louder than anything he could have stayed to say. That kind of exit is a mirror. It forces her to see the contrast, to feel what life is like without that grounding presence.